Dave slowly turns around. He can tell immediately what Josh is looking at. Standing in the very back of the theater away from them is a man standing in the corner with its hands by its sides. Its back is to them and it's looking down with a hood over its head. Dave turns his whole body around to look at this thing right as this thing turns around real quick and looks directly at them. It has these deep, dark, sunken eyes and its face looks like it had been very badly burned, and it's looking at them before it just turns and runs out the back of the theater. Josh believed that that was an intruder. Dave was fairly certain that that was just another example of this entity that haunts the theater. But they would search the building and they could never find that cloaked figure again. Dave would do some additional digging on the history of the theater. It would turn out that in the 40s there was this horrible fire and a man had been trapped in the basement when the fire had erupted. And he had died inside of the theater. And so Dave would share this information with Josh. They believed that what they were witnessing was the ghost of that man who died in that fire. From the time Garnett Spears was born, he was a sick child. It was determined Garnett's sodium levels were too high, which was most likely the cause for his upset stomach. And so the doctor gave Garnett an IV. Immediately, Garnett seemed better off. And then afterwards, when Lacey asked the doctor why could this be happening, he said he didn't know. He gave her special formula to use, and then he sent her on her way. Garnett continued to get sick, be brought into the doctor's office, only to discover his sodium levels were elevated again. And so for the next few years, life went on like that. Garnett woke up with a high fever and stomach pains, and on the drive into the hospital, he had a seizure. And after he was back to normal, they said they wanted to keep him at the hospital for a couple of days to observe him. 2 days after arriving, he suddenly seemed to be in much worse shape. When they tested his blood, sure enough, his sodium levels were at an all-time high. And so after giving him an IV and attempting to lower his sodium levels, the damage had been done. This final enormous sodium spike had led to massive brain swelling that ultimately killed him a couple of days later. Doctors were baffled at how his sodium could have spiked because they were closely monitoring what was going into his body. And so they reviewed all of his medical files, and that included looking at the footage of the camera that had been set up at the foot of the bed facing Garnett. They saw his own mother, Lacey, take him out of bed carrying a white cup and an attachment to Garnett's feeder tube. She walks him into the bathroom, she brings him back, puts him back in bed, and seconds later he's violently ill. They come in, they test his blood, and what do you know? The sodium is at that critical high point that ultimately killed him. Police launch an investigation, they go to Lacey's house, and as soon as they walk inside, there is table salt all over the house. And inside of the boy's room was an IV stand with this brackish looking liquid inside of an IV bag that they tested, and it was salt water that contained the equivalent of 70 salt packets. Lacey had been intentionally poisoning her son with too much salt since he was born because she liked the attention she received. Lacey was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. 8 months after the Coxies were reported missing, 2 more residents of Spartanburg went missing as well. Kayla and Charlie stopped returning text messages or answering phone calls. The police finally obtained a search warrant that would allow them to look at their respective cell phone records. Her last known location was inside of the same 95-acre plot of land that the Coxies had been in before they went missing. The police put in for a search warrant, and at the same time, another group of police officers went to Todd Kohlhepp's house. At the same time, the team of police officers were kind of grilling Todd at his house. The other team that was outside of the 95-acre property, they found out their search warrant had been granted. And so they got out their metal cutting saws and their bolt cutters, and they began cutting into all of these locks and chains. And when they finally got that door open, they were absolutely astounded at what they saw inside. Police had just discovered Kayla. She was in rough shape, and she had a metal chain wrapped around her neck that was anchored to the wall, and she was handcuffed, but she was alive. Kayla says she was contacted by a friend of hers, Todd Kohlhepp, and he told her that he was still looking for people to clean up the property. Kayla would tell Charlie, and Charlie, just being a good boyfriend, said, you know what, I'll tag along with you. And as soon as the couple is standing in front of Todd just casually pulls out a gun and shoots Charlie. Todd aims the gun at Kayla and says, if you go anywhere, I will kill you and I will kill your family. So he brings her inside, he locks her up, and for 65 days, she would remain his prisoner. Todd would once or twice a day come down and do whatever he wanted with her. Kayla truly did not expect ever to be rescued. They immediately radio over to the other team that were still at Todd Kohlhepp's residence, and they tell them, hey, this is what Kayla just told us. Todd's reaction to this news was also captured on video.
We have Kayla. She has told us that you shot and killed Charlie.
I didn't shoot anybody, sir.
Okay, why'd you lock her in a container in your property?
I was talking.
She's saying you buried Charlie's body on that property.
I'm only an attorney.
He would eventually confess not only to killing Charlie and kidnapping Kayla, but also to killing Johnny and Megan Coxey. Charlie, Johnny, and Megan's bodies would all be discovered in shallow graves right outside of that shipping container. Todd told police after he had confessed to these murders that he could actually confess to even more murders. Back in 2003, he had walked into a motorbike shop and killed 4 of their staff members. He had blatantly admitted to Kayla when she was in captivity that his body count was in the high 2 digits. Todd was ultimately sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, which means he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Jim was a part of a 20-person climbing party from Seattle, Washington. Their plan was to go to Mount St. Helens, hike up above the tree line, pick a spot, and then ski back down again. So the group arrives at Mount St. Helens, they hike up the mountain, and Jim says to the group, hey, why don't I ski down a little ways, and I'll take a picture of you guys as you pass, and then I'll follow you down to the bottom. He skis down a little ways and then turns left into an area called Dog's Head. But as soon as he turned left into that area, he was out of view of the main group. So after a few minutes, they head down and they make that left. But when they bank around the corner, Jim's not there. And so someone said, well, maybe he got annoyed with us because we were taking so long to get ready up there and he just already went to the bottom. And so they agreed that's what he did. And so they got back together again and they headed down to the bottom. But when they got to the bottom, Jim wasn't there. And so they sat there for a few extra minutes looking up at the mountain, and they're kind of scanning down at the bottom and they're looking all over the place, but there's no sign of Jim. And so the group started to get really worried and they contacted authorities. The first search team arrived. They found Jim Carter's ski tracks. They were total straight lines, like he was not trying to slow down. In fact, he was just trying to go as fast as he possibly could. And at some point he began leaping over these huge ice crevasses that if you miss time, it's a death sentence. And then his tracks got all the way to the edge where it overlooked Ape Canyon and he went flying off. 75 people combed the entirety of Ape Canyon, and finally, after 10 days of finding no trace of Jim Carter, the search was terminated. The only rational thing investigators could point to was he was diabetic and he had forgotten his insulin that day, so perhaps he became hypoglycemic and then managed to ski off the cliff into Ape Canyon, where he landed in such a way that he remained hidden. Or, like the head of the search party seems to think, he was being pursued, and then presumably whatever forced him off the edge went down and scooped him up and took him away. But unless someone finds some other piece of compelling evidence, we will probably never know for sure what happened to Jim Carter. Paul told Tim and Max that if they wanted to find some real treasure, they would have to go looking inside of the abandoned hospital. So the boys drove their bikes the couple of miles over to where this hospital was. Once all 3 of them got inside, they decided, we're gonna go in the basement. And what they see is just deep, dark, murky, standing water. Paul finally says, I'm going. He takes his first step into the water. And before long, he says he's reached the basement floor and he's up to his chest in this disgusting water. And he says, you can't see down either hallway. At this point, Tim and Max feel compelled to go down there with their friend. They wade their way over next to Paul. As the boys were standing in the middle of the hallway, not making any moves in either direction, they suddenly hear something down the far right side of the hallway. And they shine their lights and they realize their view's completely obstructed, and whatever's made this sound, they can't see it. It's blocked by the generator and the filing cabinet. And as they're shining their lights, they still can't see anything. They hear a massive splash, like someone cannonballed at the far end of the hallway. The boys do not stick around. They immediately turn around, they run all the way back to their bikes, and they're sitting there heaving, and they look at each other and they start laughing. Paul says to Tim and Max that they should totally go back in there. It's silence inside of the basement. And then Paul, out of nowhere, takes his flashlight and throws it into the water. Paul turns to Tim and Max and says, the reason I threw it is now we have to go in because I have to get my flashlight. He takes a deep breath and he goes under the water. He immediately hears the muffled screams of Tim and Max up on the surface. He feels one of them yank on his shirt. He comes out of the water and he turns and he sees Tim and Max booking it for the stairs. He can hear the sound of something huge swimming up the hallway towards him. For a brief second, he raises his flashlight. This dark silhouette lying horizontal in the water is violently swimming up the hall towards him. Paul turns and runs towards the stairs, and they run all the way out to the break in the fence where they hop on their bikes and they bike away. The boys believe it was an alligator living in the basement of this hospital, but they never found out for sure. They never went back to that hospital. 37-year-old Carl Herrick and his cousin Henry decided to go to West Townshend to do some deer hunting. The pair got separated, and Henry spent some time yelling for Carl and looking around for him, but he couldn't find him. And Henry waited around for a little while for Carl, but he had this sinking feeling that something was wrong, and so relatively quickly, he left to get police. For 3 days, they combed the entire area, and there was just not a sign of Carl anywhere. On the third day, Henry discovered Carl's body. He was lying motionless face down in a clearing in the woods. Carl was deceased. However, there weren't any obvious injuries to Carl's body. He had some minor scratching on his arms and on his hands, but that was about it. Henry looked around the area and he found Carl's rifle that was loaded leaning up against a tree 70 feet away from where Carl was. Next to his rifle on the ground was an expended shell casing. Also, around Carl's body were apparently huge bear tracks. The official cause of death was baffling. Carl apparently was squeezed to death to the point where his rib broke and punctured his lung. 6-year-old Haley Zega was on a hike with her grandparents. Haley spots a waterfall that's off the side of the path, and she wants to go to it. And it was something that the grandparents just did not feel comfortable letting their granddaughter do, and so they told Haley no. And as they're walking, Haley would just slow down more and more. She was intentionally trying to take as long as she could, but the grandparents made sure they kept her in their view. So they would walk a little ways and turn, and she'd be right there. And then at some point when they turned, she wasn't there. The grandparents just ran all up and down this trail screaming for Haley, and they never found her, and so they ran down and they called police. The largest search and rescue mission in the history of Arkansas was launched for Haley Zega. But after 2 days, despite this incredible search, really no progress had been made. The only thing that had been found was one of the dog teams had tracked her scent up to a nearby road where the dog stopped, meaning the scent is now gone. And unfortunately, what that told investigators is it looks like Haley got picked up by some motorist. Orville, along with his younger brother and his cousin, headed off to a river valley just outside of Yellowstone National Park to do some hunting. The following morning, he woke up his brother and cousin and told them he was going to go and track this animal for no longer than about an hour. Early the next morning, the two men got up hoping to see Orville, but he had not returned. The sheriff's department, along with hundreds of volunteers, descended into this area, but there was just no sign of Orville. Then, on the third evening of the search, one of the searchers was up in the mountains, and the searcher saw there was a little campfire that had been set up in the middle of nowhere, and next to this fire was a pair of boots. And then the searcher noticed there were tracks leaving this campfire, and these tracks were made with bare feet. And so the searcher just began following these tracks. And it's very thickly forested, and it's starting to get dark, and he sees this dark figure kind of slowly moving up the mountain quite a ways away from him. It looks like a man. And so the searcher thinks that's gotta be Orville. Something's wrong with him. You know, who knows what's going on with him, but I gotta get his attention. Searcher yells out to this guy, but even though he was clearly in earshot, this guy just did not stop moving. And so he pulls out his pistol and fires 3 shots into the air. But again, this figure didn't stop. They didn't react, no flinching. They just kept moving up and over the top of the mountain and out of sight. And he's thinking, you know what? It's too dark. I gotta go back. And so the next morning, this huge search party gets to that ravine. So much snow had fallen, all the tracks have all been covered up. They couldn't find any trace of this shoeless man. Many believe the shoeless man was Orville. And in fact, the local newspapers at the time speculated as much. But if it was Orville, why didn't he turn around when someone was yelling his name? And where was he going walking barefoot in a snowstorm in the middle of the night? Others have speculated this was not Orville, that it was some other person or some other creature lurking around the woods at night, and that perhaps they had something to do with whatever happened to Orville. No one ever found any traces of Orville or the shoeless man ever again. 5 members of the Van Ulst family arrived at the Devil's Den State Park. They headed down to the swimming area, which was this creek that led up to the side of a dam. Once they arrived at the creek, Catherine and her 2 brothers jumped in the water and started goofing around, and there were some other kids there they were playing with as well, and their father just sat on the edge to watch. But at some point when he was looking at his sons, he looked back at Catherine and she was gone. And so he's looking all around and he's thinking to himself, I just saw her on the rocks like seconds ago. Where could she have gone? Catherine's father is screaming for Catherine. He's enlisted the help of everybody at this campground that's in the vicinity. I mean, the whole area is getting searched and there's no sign of this girl. And after about an hour of looking, Catherine's father went and got police. After 2 days of searching the very thick forest that surrounded this dam, she wasn't there. 6 days after Catherine went missing, a group of searchers were located 7 miles way into the forest, and they're yelling Catherine's name when this little girl wearing only a bathing suit walks out of a cave, looks down at them and just says, Here I am. It was Catherine. They brought her to the hospital and the doctors looked at her and said, yep, besides some superficial cuts and some bug bites, she's fine. And 2 days later, she was discharged. So this 8-year-old, who's never spent any time in the woods before, survives on her own for 6 days and 6 nights with only a bathing suit on. While she was found 7 miles away from where she went missing, that's what you see on a map, those 7 miles. In the wild, you don't walk perfectly straight lines. There's too many obstructions. And so rescuers believe the minimum real distance she would have covered was about 30 miles. And she did it barefoot. When authorities asked her, how did you do this? She said, I don't know. I don't remember how I got lost in the first place. I only remember sleeping on warm grass the first night. And then her next memory is waking up inside of a cave on day 6. Some say there was something in the forest that chased her and adrenaline kicked in. And because it was so traumatic, she forgot the experience. But like virtually all of the missing 411 stories, we have a lot more questions than answers. Ron said this campsite was the closest to heaven he thinks he'll ever get. They'd had a great day of hunting and they were standing around the campfire just chatting with each other when they started hearing a grunting sound not far away from them in the forest. It was like a whooping sound you would expect from an ape, and then another creature somewhere else made a responding whoop. The men were huddled around inside of the shelter looking at each other like, what is that? They heard these creatures running towards the camp. These creatures, which are now one on one side of the camp and one on the other, begin speaking to each other in a language that almost sounds human, but it was nonsensical. They started whooping again and ran off. The next day, when the sun came up, the men were out of that camp as fast as they could. But as soon as they got out of the woods and back to their homes, Ron became obsessed with whatever it was that was making that sound. He so desperately wanted to find out what it was. And so he convinced the other 3 members to come with him and go back to the campsite, except this time Ron was going to bring an audio recorder and he was going to try to capture some audio of these creatures. 4 men went back to the campsite, and at some point in the evening, Ron said he heard footsteps way out in the middle of the forest, and they sounded like they were running towards the camp. The 4 men sprint inside the shelter, lock it behind them, and Ron turns on the audio recorder. After being recorded, Ron sent it to Dr. R. Lynn Curlin, and they concluded that 1, it was unaltered, and 2, whatever was making the sounds could not have been a man because their vocal range was dramatically higher and lower than that of a human's. The creature that was making the sound most likely was between 7'3" and 8 feet tall.
Right there, I just seen movement right through there.
Despite numerous attempts to debunk this recording, it still stands as a legitimate, unedited recording. Although what they were recording is still a mystery. There were 2 searchers well outside of the primary search area. They spotted her. Overall, she seemed okay. She said that she was walking behind her grandparents and that she looked down, and then when she looked up again, she didn't know where she was. It got dark and she slept on top of that bluff. And she said, that's where Alicia told me to stay. And they were like, who's Alicia? And she said, oh, she's my imaginary friend. I met her on the bluff. And Haley said, Alicia led me down the bluffs. And she stood in front of me and made sure that I didn't fall forward. She has black hair, brown eyes. She's 4 years old. And then Haley began singing songs that she had learned from Alicia. There was another little girl who had gone missing in the exact same spot as Haley 23 years earlier. She was 4 years old. She had black hair, brown eyes. Her name was Alana, and she had died on those bluffs. News outlets were saying this imaginary friend was actually Alana and that she was Haley's guardian angel. Haley, who's now 25 years old, says, I don't know who or what she was, but she saved my life. Billionaire by the name of Robert Bigelow, who had invested millions of dollars in National Institute for Discovery Science, specifically to research what he described as high strangeness, which really is just paranormal. So he purchases the ranch, and so they move into Skinwalker Ranch, and these 2 researchers are up on this ridge, kind of obscured and hidden, and they see this orange orb take shape, and you can clearly make out that it's this oval-shaped opening. They see this black human-like creature crawling out of this orange portal onto the ground, and then it starts running up the hill towards them, and they can hear the shale under its feet as it runs up, and it goes right past them. About 30 feet away from them, they're looking at it, and it just barrels past them at a full sprint up into the mountainside. There's been numerous books put together by some of the people that were a part of this NIDS research team, and to this day they believe that what they saw was a result of some paranormal activity. Some hikers came out of the tree line into Johnson Meadows. They notice up ahead what looks like a tent and a campsite. The campsite was definitely abandoned, and it looked totally destroyed. And so later that day, some Madera County sheriffs made their way out to Johnson Meadows. They would search the campsite and they would find some ID cards, and the name on those ID cards was Sandra Hughes. When Sandra's family heard about the state of Sandra's campsite, they told the sheriffs that Sandra was incredibly environmentally conscious. She would never, ever leave her campsite looking that way on purpose. Something else had to have happened. Over the next 2 days, a massive search was launched to look for Sandra. No one had seen Sandra, and despite this massive search effort over these first 2 days, nothing new was discovered that could lead authorities to where she had gone. But then, 2 days into her disappearance, Sandra Hughes was spotted. Some hikers were cutting through the Johnson Meadows area, and they saw this woman who was just standing off to the side of the meadow. She was by herself. She had no gear with her. She was barefoot. She had a black shirt on. She had blue jeans on. She had a bruise on her face, and she was just kind of standing there as if she was waiting for something. She didn't wave them down. She didn't act distressed. She didn't look like she needed any help. They just kind of saw this person minding their own business, and they walked right on past her. It wasn't until those hikers got to the parking lot that they saw all these missing person flyers out for Sandra Hughes, and they would see the picture of Sandra and they would see her distinctive blue hair, that they would say, oh my goodness, the barefoot woman we just saw standing in the forest is Sandra Hughes. And so the hikers called the sheriff's office. They headed out to where they had claimed to have seen her, but there was no sign of her, and there was nothing left behind that would indicate where she might have gone. The following day, Sandra's vehicle was located. And the vehicle was actually at the bottom of a ravine. Authorities believed Sandra was driving the car on that road and then hit a tree, and then she rolled off the embankment down to the bottom of the ravine. Someone had pulled out all of the things inside of the car and kind of thrown them carelessly all over the forest floor. The Madera County sheriffs couldn't help but think that this was eerily similar to how her campsite looked. They thought, maybe Sandra got hurt and the injury has impaired her cognitive abilities, and so now, maybe she's lost in the woods and doesn't know what's going on. And so a decision was made to just leave her vehicle where it was. Authorities left a note in the window of her vehicle that said, hey Sandra, we're looking for you. Please call this number. If you see this, your family really misses you. The search for Sandra would continue over the next several days. Nothing new was discovered, but there was one more terrifying twist coming. A year later, Jake Gorba, his wife Victoria, and their 3 young children decide, let's just pull over and we'll have a quick lunch. They hear their 3-year-old son named Caden start talking. He was turned and looking out his open window into the forest, engaged in some sort of intense conversation. And so Victoria looks at her son and goes, "Who are you talking to?" And he would say, "There's a woman out there and she needs our help." They turn back to Caden and they say, "Honey, we don't see anyone out there." And he says, "Mom, she's lying face down and she's dead. She had a black t-shirt on, blue jeans on, and blue hair." When the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, they brought with them a lineup of several women. And Caden looks at these pictures and he picks out 3 pictures. All 3 are Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs would return to that section of Shut-Eye Peak, but like always, there was nothing. As of today, we still have no idea where Sandra is or what happened to her. A 14-year-old boy named Sebastian Guerrero decided to go for a walk up in the mountains, and he wanted to go explore the different caves. There was light coming out of one of the cave entrances, and he's starting to hear sounds. He realizes it's definitely a person, and they're definitely screaming. There also sounds to be a large contingent of other people, and he peeks his head right around the edge of the opening, and he looks inside, and what he sees causes him to just freeze in terror. He would run nearly 10 miles to the nearest police station. The way he described it to police was he basically thought he saw vampires. One of the police officers, his name was Luis Martinez, he would say, "Okay, kid, Bring me to this cave and I'll have a look around. Later on in the day, the other police officers, they realized that Luis and the boy had not returned yet. The police and the Mexican army, they head out to where this cave was. And when they saw what was inside the cave, it would shock the world. Two brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, they decided they were going to pull off their biggest heist yet. They were going to rip off an entire town. They would convince the villagers that they, the brothers, were actually prophets of an exiled Incan god. And if these villagers did everything they said, they would make them rich. And so almost immediately, the villagers effectively became the Hernandez brothers' slaves. But after a couple of months of this, some of the villagers started to be frustrated with the Hernandez brothers. And so the brothers recruit this young woman named Magdalena Solis, and they tell her, hey, we need you, if you're willing, to come with us and pretend to be an actual Incan goddess. And so when you show up, they'll know that we were serious. The plan worked exactly as the brothers wanted it to. However, there was an element of their plan they could not possibly have accounted for, and that was what Magdalena did next. When I was 16 years old, I was an avid snowboarder. Me, Nick, and Wolf would go up to Nick's family's cabin. Unexpectedly, Nick's father passed away. So we make the trip up to New Hampshire. So that night, as I'm laying in bed, I'm thinking about how dark and quiet it is. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch. And then the door opens, and this shadow figure walks into the room. But its hips are so high, I instantly was frozen with terror. And begins to walk down right next to me. And it does another quick movement, but it's facing away from me now. And it bows onto and then down through Nick's bed and disappears. Finally, I hear Nick's mom out in the living room making coffee. And the only thing I could think to do was to just ask, did either of your two sons, Nick's older two brothers, did they stop by? She's like, no. And she just goes, I heard my husband here last night too. So the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan are making their way to Howland Island. They get off track somehow and they wind up crash landing 350 miles away on Niku Maroro Island on one of the reefs. Noonan probably dies on impact, and Earhart, who's badly wounded and probably bleeding, she gets onto the island and she makes her way up to that area where that campfire was found. And for some amount of time, Earhart is able to survive off of whatever she had on her in those glass bottles, but in her weakened state and bleeding, at some point she probably attracted the coconut crabs who one night came out and swarmed her, ripped her to pieces, and ate her. In the 1930s, notorious dictator Joseph Stalin began deporting people that he viewed as threats to the regime. The worst fate of anybody deported to Siberia has to be the roughly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island off the western side of Siberia. As the survivors disembark onto this snowy island, they see immediately that there's nothing on it. It's this tiny little island. There's no shelter. There's no food. There's no tools. There's no way to make shelter. They're just totally stranded. Their Soviet guards had promised them a ration of flour, but for the first 4 days, they refused to give it to them, and another 295 people died. And so by the time the guards actually took their boats into shore to give the flour to these people, they were starving to death, and they rushed the boats to try to steal the flour, and the guards began shooting at them, took the flour, and went back out to the water. Almost immediately, cannibalism became a thing, and there were these roving gangs of people who would just go around and murder the weak and eat them. So Skylar, she stands up and she turns. Her back is to her two friends. And as soon as she starts walking, what she would have heard is the sound of her two friends standing up as well, and then loudly saying, 1, 2, 3. And on 3, Skylar would have felt 2 knives being plunged into her back by Rachel and by Sheila. Sheila tackles her from behind. She gets her on the ground. She pins her on her back. Between Rachel and Sheila, they managed to hold Skylar's hands down, at which point Sheila and Rachel began taking turns stabbing her in the chest and in the neck. And at some point, she just kind of gives up and she says, "Why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me?" And eventually, Rachel stops stabbing Skylar, but Sheila doesn't. Sheila keeps on going until, quote, her neck stopped making gurgling sounds. He normally would just eat the apples that were right outside of his house, but he had always been tantalized by the sugar apple trees that were inside of the fenced-off section of Komodo Island. This section was, of course, teeming with Komodo dragons, and so as a result, the locals basically fenced it off. But Mohammed had always wanted those sugar apples. He'd grown up here. He never got to have one. And so this day, for whatever reason, he decided, today's the day I'm going to get one. And so after looking around and feeling like the coast was clear, he hopped the fence and he ran out to the sugar apple tree. He's reaching out and extending his arm just far enough. He wants to get one more apple, and he loses his footing and he falls to the ground. And then she hears the sound of two Komodo dragons running through the tall grass. She can see the grass moving as these two massive creatures are running and grunting at full speed towards Mohammed. Mohammed, when he fell, he had cut himself, and they smelled his blood and they charged over. The authorities were able to get out there pretty quickly, and they were able to get the Komodo dragons off before they actually consumed him, but he was already dead. And what she saw was absolutely horrifying. That popping sound she heard outside of the plane was the sound of the engine underneath the left wing exploding. When that window broke open, Jennifer, who was sitting closest to it, was immediately sucked through the window. So no one is looking around, taking stock of what's going on and assessing what to do next. Everybody's in survival mode and is basically just focused on themselves. And so despite Holly yelling out and trying to wave to people, it was worthless. Jennifer was just stuck out the window and no help was coming. And it was during this time, as Holly is holding on to her waist and she's holding on to the girl, that Holly is thinking, Jennifer, she's been stuck outside the plane where there's no oxygen for almost 10 minutes. Nobody can survive that. But there's a detail in Holly's story that makes her experience even more traumatic. Because, if Harry Houdini can't perform this stunt, then certainly no one else can either. But in 1990, a daring 32-year-old man named Joe Burris decided he would be the person who would finally conquer this infamous stunt. And so with all these TV cameras rolling, the assistants walk up to Joe and they begin shackling his wrists, and they put these chains around his body, and then they lifted him up and put him inside of the see-through plastic coffin. And then this coffin was lowered into the 7-foot pre-dug hole that was right nearby. Once Joe gave the signal that he was ready to go, they would fill this hole in, and the stunt that he would perform would be to escape being buried alive. As they're watching this hole and as they're filming this hole, all of the cement in the hole suddenly drops about a foot. I get back from snowboarding and I'm laying in bed and I'm constantly looking over at the digital clock when I heard those footsteps on the wraparound porch again. I cannot move. I'm drenched in sweat just from the few seconds that it's taken this thing to go from the door to the front of my bedroom. The door opens, it walks into the room, goes right past the foot of my bed, and I'm again petrified. Walks down the aisle between me and Nick. So it turns away from me and does the same thing it did the night before, folds onto Nick and disappears into the ground. When I heard Nick's mom out in the other room, it was like such a relief. And so I hear her and I go right out to the living room and I tell her everything. At the end of it, or towards the end, she just kind of stops me. She's like, John, I told you yesterday, and again, I heard it last night. That's just my husband. I heard him last night too. You got nothing to worry about. And I was like, no. I felt so helpless. That night I'm laying there, and after all my attempts to keep Nick and Wolf awake, they fall asleep. I hear those footsteps on the wraparound porch. The door opens and I hear the sleigh bells. Everything was the same. It walked into the house, but instead of going down the hallway towards our room, it kept walking into the lofted area. Walks up the stairs, and that's where Nick's mom slept. She was upstairs. I was now coming up on 3 days without sleep, so at some point that night, I did fall asleep, probably just out of sheer exhaustion. Now probably like 5 in the morning, I wake up again and I can hear Nick's mom. It didn't sound like she was making coffee. It sounded like something was wrong. And she's standing over this coffee table at the foot of the stairs and she's crying. Come here. She points to the coffee table and she's down on her knees looking at the table. And now I can tell she's probably crying tears of joy, because scratched into the coffee table were the words, "I love you." I was like, I'm done. Bodyguard who stood directly behind him was 22-year-old Melvit Altuntaş. He was a Turkish native who for 2.5 years had served on an elite riot police unit. Andre looked down at the podium at his notes, and then he looked up at the room that was filled with journalists and dignitaries, and he composed himself, he cleared his voice, and he began to speak. Behind him, Mevlut, the bodyguard, opened his jacket slightly and continued staring at the back of Andre's head. And then in one swift motion, he drew a pistol and fired 3 shots into the ambassador's back. And then when the ambassador fell to the ground, Mevlut moved on top of him and fired 4 more shots, killing him. Guests started screaming and running for cover. Meanwhile, Mevlut pointed his finger into the sky and yelled, "Do not forget Aleppo, do not forget Syria." And then he began walking around the exhibit, smashing the pictures on the wall before Turkish security forces showed up. There was a gunfight and Mevlut was killed. But regardless of why it happened, what the world remembers from this event is the award-winning photograph that was taken of Mevlut immediately after he committed the attack. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. But the case gets even stranger because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks, and then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan.